Okay, welcome to this year's um, 2025 Regulatory Horizon Scan, where we're delighted to have, as last year actually, Principal of Bovill Newgate, Michael Lawrence, ex-FCA. I'll bring Michael in very shortly. What I'm going to do is just leave it for 30 seconds or so to get people on board because there's lots of people in the waiting room and they're starting to come through right now, which is great. Are those of you already in? Please don't refrain. Ask any questions that you've got. This is a great opportunity to engage with someone of the pedigree that Michael has around all things governance, risk, and compliance. And I think it's also a great opportunity with all that's going on with the industry and the sector and the financial planning profession to take a look at what are the key areas that are going to be potentially touching and affecting your businesses this year. What are the risks, but also what are the opportunities? So we're going to hopefully put a positive focus on this on the next hour. For those of you who don't know me or Model Office, my name is Chris Davies. I'm founder and CEO of Model Office. What is Model Office? We are classed as a RegTech. We employ AI within our RegTech, and what we're effectively doing is allowing firms to build what is classed in the FCA call a third line of defense in your business, which is basically internal audit across the governance, risk, and compliance. But also, we streamline a lot of the compliance activities across things like client file reviews, policy document audits, and creating automated audit reporting. So if you want to find out more about us, please do visit our website. So really today is more of a free-flowing conversation between myself and Michael, and hopefully your question. We do have some polls that we may deploy. So from that side of it, we as we go through today, and depending on what we cover, then we've got a few poll questions which we'd like to get your feedback on. We've written a blog on what we see as what's coming down on the horizon for this year, which is in that URL you can see on your screen, and you will get copies of all these slides at the end. We'll send this out to you post the webinar event. I'd like to wish you all Kung Hei Fat Choi. I lived in Hong Kong for 15 years, and it's the year of the wood snake. So may I wish you all a very happy Chinese New Year. May it bring you your business lots of prosperity and good tech fortune. So what are we seeing? At Model Office, we have a house view really of what we're seeing currently at play and where firms really need to be mindful of about where the regulator the areas the regulator are very interested in. And the first key area, obviously, I would generally focus on is the consumer duty. Even though it's implemented, we now what we're doing is we're doing a lot of focus for firms on validation of the implementation program to make sure, because if you remember the FCA's phrase, it was not once and done. We also see an interesting trend that consumer duty can actually drive the cost and prices area, and I'll be interested in Michael's view on this, on the fair value and all that stuff, because what we've got on the horizon as well is the advice gap, and on the advice gap piece, there was a great piece of research that was done by the Lancat consultancy last year, which those of you who know the Lancat, they produced some really neat research. And what they basically looked at is the fact that some of advisor firms are actually offloading clients because at the end of the day, it's not affordable to service them. So are they falling into the advice gap? Who knows? So that's an interesting one that we can take a look at. Data NMI, which is our world. Our mantra is: you haven't got the data, it didn't happen. If you got the data, it better have happened. And I think that's very much front and center as we go through. Model Office have shortly a professional working group starting in next month. Not next month, in March, which is really focused on your data. You're more than welcome to find out more information about that, and we're inviting the FCA along to that, as well as other market participants, to take a look at what are the key challenges on accessing, identifying, monitoring, reporting on data. Lines of defence, well, a third line of defence is your internal audit. And I think that is more important than ever before, as we'll talk about in a minute, regarding the data points, particularly the FCA want to see. And what we're going to see this year is more data requests from the FCA. They'll be probably one of the first ones to all the IFA community and the financial planning community very shortly. There'll be another one, or I think there's been two so far. Michael will probably correct me on this, to the wealth management community. So I think there'll be more on that. And lots of focus, really, I think, this year on economic recovery, maybe, although we're still in choppy economic conditions, and we've also got the potential that technology can bring as it's embedded in, particularly AI, to firms where they can become more streamlined, which may help, which could be a good identification for growth. So today, really, what I'd like to do is just focus on some key issues, which I think are really, really important for businesses as they're growing and building, and obviously making sure that they are compliant. And this is, this isn't necessarily the areas that we'll talk about today, but I'm sure Michael would like to touch on a few of these areas. The first area, I think, that's kind of crucial. We ran a CISI regulatory update last week. We had Denton's on talking about streamlining the FCA handbook, and some really interesting points there that were coming out. For example, did you know that the SMCR, the certification regime, is now under scrutiny? That was actually driven by the government, not the regulator. So that's an interesting one. You've also got the call that the FCA may be looking at ditching the consumer duty champion. Well, is that a good idea or a bad idea? That's an interesting one. So lots of meat to unpack from that, because there is tension, as there always is, really, between governments and regulators. What we class as Suitability 2.0 is the ongoing advice review now that's coming through, and obviously the retirement income advice review, and where we're going with that is going to be an interesting issue. Consolidation review, which, if you remember Nick Hume's Dear CEO letter in October last year, October the 7th, was pulled out some key issues: ongoing advice review, retirement income, as well as consolidation, and how that may affect your businesses. Polluter pays, looking at governance and oversight, redress liabilities, and obviously looking at the advice gap, I think is going to be a big one, as well as looking at what data is required. When we come to Suitability 2.0, it never fails to amaze me. I'd love to know Michael's views on this. Is that over the last, certainly, well over a decade now, you look at some of these papers, and by the way, the FSA papers in July 2012 and I think it was in 2011, which were looking at risk, attitude to risk assessment and replacement business and so forth. They're still excellent papers that really should be applied in your businesses. But there's lots more there. TR 16.1, which was assessing suitability, research and due diligence. You've got the advising on pension transfers. You've obviously got the assessment review that came out in 2017, and fair treatment of vulnerable customers. But the key issue with this, we call these the papers the Magnificent Seven. You could probably add more in here, but is that the themes that come out are all the same. So if you go back across all these papers, it's inconsistent information, inconsistent risk profiling, poor evidence for advice, poor governance and controls, low evidence for ability to monitor and assess ongoing advice needs. And I would suggest that when you're looking at your business and looking at the GRC, governance, risk and compliance assessment, on a monthly, quarterly, half-yearly basis, you might want to keep on addressing these themes in your business, because certainly the FCA are going to be very interested when they come out with their data requests. The other thing to mention as well, this is a couple of our firms actually had a visit from the FCA last year, and they were pretty rigorous in their approach. So they're definitely starting to bear their teeth, if you like, and they were asking for the business and advice register information, governance, risk and compliance data, and consumer duty implementation and validation process, and that was all meant to be delivered in a meaningful format within 2 weeks. Right, okay, go figure. At the end of the day, that's going to be I think on the up this year when firms are getting these data and information requests. I think a big focus that is probably not looked at often enough is also looking at the non-financial misconduct review. And again, if you're looking at the whistleblower stats from the FCA, and this was I think it was Q3 last year stats. If you look at the most the key areas, it's all about behaviour, it's all about conduct, and it's not necessarily just around about the more data, financial driven areas around mis-selling and AML at the bottom there. So again, there needs to be real focus within business on their culture, on their conduct, on their competence regarding these key issues. The interesting thing regarding the areas for improvement under the Consumer Duty, we still think that these need to be focused on. It's not once and done. I'll let Michael touch on that a bit more, and again, you'll get copies of these slides so you can have a look at all these areas. And don't forget, obviously, we're putting a positive slant on it. There's lots of good areas that but to look at the good stuff that you're doing within your business. We always get the feedback, well, we're doing this anyway. We're all kind of like pushback to that is prove it. Show where is the evidence, where is the data, where is the MI that you can report fairly instantly in a holistic manner that you're showing that you're doing all that good work. And that's the challenge, and that's what we do at Model Office. I think this is interesting when it comes to data requests. We're working with the team at the FCA at the moment around about this issue. And these are the key areas that we're seeing that they're going to be interested in this year. And I think the key issue with that is quite simply, you have got to know your business better than ever before. We don't believe that the vast majority of businesses do through a data lens, this is, and therefore firms need to up the ante on how they're collecting data, analyzing data, what analytic tools that they're using, and how they're reporting on that data. That needs to be front and center of your board meetings, of your team meetings, of your wealth management committee meetings, of your compliance meetings. That, I think, is going to be a key consideration by the FCA in 2025. The other thing to mention is obviously on the consolidators. And if you've read, I'm sure one of the papers that you could put on that Magnificent Seven and make it the enigmatic eight is looking at the consolidators position and the consolidation review, which is definitely going to come through at some stage, I think, this year. And that is interesting because it's been a very hot market over the last few years, as we know. I don't see that necessarily cooling down too much. Lots of good firms out there who are wanting to sell, lots of appetite to buy. But I think the key issue with that is clients first, clients front and center of this. And the 2017 paper, which I know Michael will know, about buying and selling client banks, is front and center here. And these are all the major issues from that paper that we would recommend any consolidators, anyone involved in M&A activity, reassess that paper and apply it to your business prior to going through that process from a research and due diligence and governance and oversight perspective. The distribution chain, I think, will be front and center again this year. All the key issues regarding looking at the research and due diligence process by the product manufacturers and I hate to say it, distributors, but that's what the FCA call you. But at the end of the day, I think the key issue with this, going back to the data issue, is how is that data flowing up and down that distribution chain? How are market participants engaging with each other from a data reporting perspective, information share perspective? I think that's going to be really, really important for all the reasons that are on this meaty slide. The other issue is client segmentation. And again, we still think there's more work needs to be done on this. We would recommend take a really granular view across client segmentation and not only look at segments, but look at sub-segments. Blend in client behavior, their propensities, their sensitivities to costs and charges, the propensity to buy certain products. Bias is really, really key, as well as looking at obviously the costs and charges from the second outcome on fair value. But also you've got to look at the key areas regarding vulnerability. Vulnerability will again be front and center this year. How you've assessed it, what's your strategy, does it meet the FCA standards from that side of it? And one of the best ways to do that, ladies and gentlemen, we think is if a lot of people say, well, how do we do this? How do we put it together? Obviously, Model Office does a lot of this, but what we deploy is really looking at this 5-tier strategy from the great piece of work that's ongoing at the FCA called the Conduct Risk Management Framework, which is really looking at identification of the risks, how you're doing that, what processes have you got involved in that, roles and responsibilities and so forth, looking at empowering individuals accountability. So that's the SMCR stuff, roles, responsibility, accountability, looking at mechanisms that you're going to improve the risk management. And that's all the digital tools that you've got in your business. Lots of great tools out there at the moment. AI is on the up, as we all know, but obviously, avoid the white noise and take a look at what the real problems are before you're looking at deploying technology. Strategic oversight, governance and oversight is front and center of everything that you need to do now. And most importantly, a lot of firms miss the fifth piece: assessing activities that could undermine good risk management. I think is key. So that's remuneration. It could be complaints procedures and so forth. Root causes and all that good stuff that the FCA came out with, in particular with the consumer duty. Final pieces from us is really looking at how everything integrates within your business. And in an ideal world, what we would like to see is an ecosystem being driven by a data lake where you've got the right technology that can then blend out and pull in the data on a two-way process to look at across what you're doing within your businesses, what tools, technologies, and processes have you got in play, and does all that data flow so that you can report on that at the click of a button. Really, really important. And the final thing I'll just mention, again, talking about internal audit and talking about third line of defense, which should not be confused with the second line of defense, which is your compliance management piece. It's really all about ensuring that you've got the data, that you know where the risks are, that you're taking ownership for your internal audit across all these, because that's going to be really, really important, as we're shortly going to find out right now from Michael about the key issues at play going in to this year. So any more information you need on us, that's who we are. We've got lots of papers and obviously, my latest book is out in a good bookstore near you, which you can read all about the key world of technology and AI and risk management and behavioral science. So what I'll do is I'll stop the share there and I'll bring in Michael. Good morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Morning, Chris.
Good. Well, it's great to have you on board. For those of you who don't know Michael, Michael's got a very interesting past, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing that he was actually an intelligence analyst for the Met Police, which I think is a very interesting skill set that I think would be very important, Michael, to your days at the FCA, as well as now as principal at Bovill Newgate. But so that's an interesting fact. But what I'm going to do really is hand over to you, Michael, and really what I'd like to do to start this and kick this off with is this piece around streamlining the rule book, because I think that then kicks on to the rest of the key themes and key issues that may be affecting firms over the next 12 months. So with that perspective, where do you see this tension going between the government demand for growth, not I wouldn't say a light touch regulatory framework, but certainly rowing back on some of the key directives that they've introduced, the FCA's introduced over the last few years?
It's a good question. I think when you look at this, I mean, what isn't in doubt is that the kind of government's growth agenda is going to be a dominant feature, if not the dominant feature of the kind of coming Parliament, which is interesting and perhaps something that people wouldn't have kind of predicted when, back before the election, you were thinking about what the impact of a kind of Labour government would be on the kind of regulatory framework. But obviously, growth is key in order for the government to be able to deliver on its objectives. And I think, there's something wrong. It's a positive thing to look at the balance of regulation and its impact on business and on consumers, because it is a balance. There is always a balance between how much structure, prescription you put in relative to then your appetite for things to go well, but also for things to go less well. And, if we look over the recent past, sometimes you can get a bit of a kind of pendulum swing of more regulation, less regulation, and the answer somewhere in the middle. But within the context of that pendulum, within the kind of recent past, probably going back, 10, 20 years, we should acknowledge that, regulation comes in with a particular set of prompts. And if it's not reviewed, then sometimes it can be, perhaps overly onerous and no longer delivering against the objective. So I think reviewing regulations is a good thing. I think the key thing is that balance of where do you intervene and how do you intervene. I mean, what I would say so far is that the FCA appears willing to play its part. If you know look at the letter from the FCA CEO to the Chancellor, there's a clear kind of appetite to do that, and some of the existing interventions it already had in place, you know, it references there. The question will be, well, how far does it need to go? And the interesting thing about that letter is that the FCA, you know, exposes this idea. You know, we're happy to deregulate, you know, subject to our kind of objectives, but that is kind of caveated by a question about what our collective risk appetite is, because if you know if we have less regulation, yes, it might help growth, but they also potentially increases risks. So I think the key thing upcoming is, you know, what's going to be done, but things will be done. But there are some challenges with that. I think even if you are removing rules, that still constitutes kind of regulatory change. You know, firms still need to deal with it, amend their processes. So there are costs to business, even when you're taking something away. And I suppose the interesting question is, at what point in the future do the benefits outweigh those costs? I think if you're looking to amend the regulatory framework, building new bits of it can sometimes be easier than and maybe more impactful than kind of wielding the scalpel and subtracting from the existing ones. I mean, you're trying to, if we continue the analogy, remove the additional unnecessary unhealthful fat that we could all live without. I certainly could, whilst not going too near any kind of essential structures and organs within the body. And that can be tricky. And then the other final two things, because it'd be good to get your perspective on this, would be, I think there's a big question about sequencing. So yes, you can look at these things in isolation. We're going to intervene in this bit of the handbook here, this bit over there, but we know that the kind of regulatory framework underpinning what firms do is multifaceted. So there's a difficult job to do to work out the right sequence of things, because if you're going on a path to simplicity, a kind of leaner, more streamlined regulatory regime, you need to move the pieces in the right order. And then the final thing is that kind of international context. So, weighing up, yes, if we do make changes here, what does that mean for the UK's kind of equivalence to broader, international regulatory, regimes? And, what does it mean in terms of the ease for firms that do operate, across different jurisdictions, easily, adapting their businesses between them, as opposed to having to design something. So lots of complex stuff there, but I think there's a clear appetite for change. What's your view, Chris?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I've worked around the world, as I said earlier on, and I've worked in Australia, I've worked in Southeast Asia, Europe, and now obviously UK. And what we've definitely I've witnessed is certainly some of the best regulatory approaches has been more of a streamlined approach, and I think the FCA have been quite clever there, because they are no doubt one of the leading regulators in the world. But this move to outcomes is really, really interesting. I think that's where they're looking at the potential for that, because that's all about outcomes, is all effectively the client journey. So it's that consumer protection piece first. And then what you're looking at is, rather than just being onerous, jumping through the regulatory hoops, which is quite transactional in its format, this is more, this is more really taking a look at, okay, well, prove to us that you've got really good lockdown and understood outcomes, and then work it back from there about what your services and your products are and so forth. And I think that is a great opportunity to then streamline, because you're not having to go into the rule book. And the other thing to mention as well, because we worked with the FCA on this back in 2018 now, which is all about digitization of the rule book. So that machine executable reporting initiative, which was run by the RegTech team, Nick Cook at the time, I thought was a great initiative. It did fall away a bit, but I think that's probably back on the horizon now, where the regulator are looking for firms to be data led, as they are, employ, as I say, data analytics, which is a good thing, because if you're employing the right data and the right tech, then you can report far more effectively and efficiently in a streamlined manner. But the tech has to be right. So we've got all that issue about legacy tech versus new tech and so forth, which I won't go there. But I think it's a great opportunity, and I don't think firms should be too afraid of this, because this outcomes focus is definitely playing to that agenda.
No, I think so. I mean, if you look at the things that are in the letter, I'll probably limit myself to the stuff in the kind of retail investment sector, which I know better. We've got a acknowledgement that the reg returns need updating. I think that's fairly key. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how that's offset in terms of the FCA's desire for more data. I know we're going to come back to that later. You've got stuff around maybe making tweaks to senior managers regime. That's an interesting one. And then you've got questions around the things that are already done. The future regulatory framework, that's in train. The new disclosure regime, that's in train. The advice guidance boundary review, that's in change in chain as well. And I think for me, the test will be when those things come to pass, because at the moment we're at the stage of, yes, we're going to be more outcomes principles based. We're going to give greater license for firms to innovate within that. But at the end of the day, you need to draw that line somewhere. And I think that'll be the test. But I think if we go by something like the advice guidance boundary review, they're kind of slightly strange consultation paper without detailed rules, which I've never seen before. But the structure of that, it's very kind of permissive, and I think firm supporting in terms of its proposed direction of travel, allowing firms to do far more than they could. So I think the signs are positive. I think that the acid test will be when the output from the call for input on the rules review in the wake of the duty comes through. What detailed rules are they going to get rid of, and are they a kind of meaningful subtraction? I think that's where we'll need to see the kind of intent of the FCA in action.
I think a really, and that's, yeah, points well made on that. And I think, one, obviously the outcomes focus is one of the byproducts of that is that the FCA actually said themselves is firms can become more innovative, right? And that's really important in this fourth industrial revolution that we're in. That they can take advantage of new tech to build an AI and so forth. I think that's one thing. I do think the consumer duty being the umbrella that it is, where you've got things like the collective investment scheme and product governance, that is a great opportunity there to refine and streamline the prod stuff and the cold stuff and other areas under this consumer duty umbrella. So I definitely see that as a great opportunity as well. Where I see it as being detrimental, well, this stuff around the SMCR and dropping the certification regime. Why? At the end of the day, the senior managers will need to know that these people are fit and proper and
Yeah.
certified and giving the right the right credentials in the business. So I just think that's a bit nuts personally, as well as I think it's a bit nuts regarding dropping the consumer duty champion.
Well, maybe we'll come on to that when we get onto the duty. I've kind of got mixed feelings on it. I can explain why in a second. What I want to say just quickly on this point is, I think for any firms that are perhaps kind of worried or concerned about the implications of moving to more kind of outcomes-based regulation, I mean, what I would say is, it's an iteration, a kind of evolution of approach rather than a massive revolution. All those documents that you had from the FCA before, I think you called them the Magnificent Seven. As a former regulator, I wouldn't have put the title on them myself for the kind of accusations it could levy at me. But I mean, I'd say all those documents are providing some granularity on the outcomes around rules, whether it's suitability or due diligence, that are already relatively high level. There are suitability rules in COBs, other than maybe for pension transfers. They don't specify on a kind of case by case basis how you have to do it. There's some kind of outcomes in terms of the things that firms need to consider, and it's then left to firms to go and work it out. So some firms will see this and go, oh, gosh, we like detailed rules. But what I'd say is, well, some of the rules already are not that detailed. Now, my sense of when we used to do work at the FCA, we'd go to the panels at the FCA, so the practitioner panel, which is bigger firms, and then the smaller businesses practitioner panel. And you'd get varying challenge from firms when we go to publish. We want to be told what to do, give us more granularity, more detail. With another group of firms say, no, tell us where you want us to get to, higher level rules, outcomes, and we'll innovate and navigate our way ourselves. So wherever you get to on this, there'll be some people that are happy with it, some people that aren't. But I think the direction of travel is positive, and I think this outcomes focused stuff is a good thing. It should help firms get where they need to go with the minimum of hassle.
Thanks. And I think let's shift in. Let's look at, because I'm looking at the attendees today. I think one of the big areas is this suitability 2.0 area that we call that, obviously not the
Yeah,
regulator. So I'm not Bovill Newgate. But from that side of it, I think firms are nervous around this ongoing review. What are firms doing on their ongoing client reviews? Are clients signed up for an annual review? If so, are they paying for it, and have they definitely received it? And how far are the FCA going to go back in their records? If they're going to go back 7 years, well, firms, I would say, who are very dependent on filing cabinets and spreadsheets, and will be challenged, as well as has a knock-on effect on the consolidators, because those consolidators have gone through the M&A process and bought up a lot of advisor firms who are paper dependent. How on earth can you prove that? From that. So I really value, and as well as I think our delegates today, participants today, your views on this ongoing review, the advice income retirement review, how that's going to play out this year.
sure. Well, we're waiting, aren't we, in terms of the next steps from the regulator on the ongoing advice review. I think in the portfolio letter, it said it was due at the end of the year, and now we're, almost at the end of January, haven't got it. So I think there's obviously, some interesting stuff there in terms of the FCA and its messaging on here, because I agree there's a bit of a pregnant pause at the moment in terms of what firms can expect. I mean, in terms of what the FCA is focused upon, I think it's going after, initially at least, the kind of low-hanging fruit, which is that, if you stand back, what is the financial advice market in the UK? It's firms providing kind of initial and then ongoing services to clients. I mean, that's how I think the majority of firms, that's their business model. I think it's over 80, almost 90% of revenue. From past data, we know that, the majority, I think over 90% of new clients going to ongoing services. So for me, the fact that the FCA looked at it as its first bit of work through the lens of the duty was not surprising. In terms of where and obviously what's it focused on? So it's focused on, well, did you review your services around the time of the consumer duty, through the lens of who they're right for, who they're wrong for, charges, are they being delivered? So again, it's the FCA using the duty as a kind of foundation to pursue its supervisory activities in a given sector. And that's going to be the pattern, I think, for the next 2 or 3 years. In terms of the focus on service delivery, I think we've seen so far from the provisions that some firms have made, that from the incidents of skilled person reviews, that obviously some firms haven't got this quite right. I mean, I think in terms of where the FCA might land, obviously going forward, I think there's definitely going to be a greater desire, going back to your point earlier, Chris, around product governance, around, I think, 5 questions. Like number one, do your customers need an ongoing service? And if they do, are they in the right type of service? So after a kind of better fit of service type to customer need, and that's obviously key and at the heart of the duty. Number 2, are they being charged a fair price for that? So looking at what you're doing relative to what you're getting in terms of charges, and then looking at that through the lens of the customer and their needs and objectives. Then are they delivered? I mean, that's the big focus of the ongoing service review. And then finally, we shouldn't forget about this. Are they delivered well? Because the whole point of an ongoing advisory service is to take account of clients' changing situations, changing needs, to explore and check and then alter whether the solution that was recommended, if needed, is updated in light of that. So, those are the 5 things that I think firms should be thinking about. In terms of where the FCA might land, I definitely think it's going to be, get your houses in order should you need to, in terms of the go forward. So, make sure that you've got the MI to kind of monitor, check, act on whether services are delivered. When they're not, what action do you need to take? If you've delivered most of it, some of it, none of it, what does that mean in terms of your ability to amend your charges? Depending upon whether it's an all-in fee or a kind of modular fee where you pay for bits as you get them. The big question, and I do wonder whether this is somewhat influencing the kind of slight delay in publication of the findings, is and what's to be done going backward. I mean, my sense from the data that we do have, if you look at the retirement income advice findings, I think reviews were delivered. I think self-reported by firms, obviously, over 93, 95% of cases. I mean, that's what we expect, isn't it? Of course, firms are seeing and reviewing their clients. So, I mean, we shall see where the FCA lands on this. It doesn't feel to me the kind of issue that is going to have big, retrospective action on it. But I think, if firms within their data MI identify some things themselves in the back book, then perhaps there's an expectation for them to, go away, look at that, work out the implications and act. But the proof will be in the pudding when the FCA publishes. So I think everyone's kind of buckled up and waiting to see where that will come out.
Indeed, as ever. I'm just going to quickly launch a poll. Hopefully, you can all see that poll, which is looking at, are you confident your business is ready for an ongoing advice review? And I think so far we've got somewhat. Oh no, it's all changing. There we go. Look at that. It's dynamic in real time. So I don't know if anybody could see this, but we've got yes at 36, somewhat 53s. I guess that's quite good. Work to do 13. So that's not bad. That's not bad. That's actually a decent start as we're only in January. So let's
Just on the output, Chris, just find out, if we look at what the FCA did when they published the findings of the retirement income advice review, and I think they're definitely, there was a mix, variable standards, I'd say. What that review, the thematic review publication was accompanied by was a kind of Dear CEO letter to firms to say, read the review, look at the findings, think about the implications for your business and act where you need to. There would definitely be something along those lines here. And I know we're going to get into it in a little bit, so I don't want to steal your thunder. But, as the FCA begins the kind of next phase of its kind of data-led supervision of the advice sector, mimicking what it's already been doing in wealth. We can talk about that in a little while. This would definitely be a focus area. So I think, within the population, I think we've got 5,500 firms in the UK with the advising permission. Probably quite a few more if you count appointed representatives as well. I think the FCA will definitely be looking to get data across that population on key risks, and this would be one. And then, as it has done in the wealth sector, and we've been helping lots of clients on the other side of this, then going in and saying, actually, you're scanning, dear firm, as a bit of an outlier on this metric or that metric. We'd like to come in, understand a little bit more. And our experience with those firms is where the firm's answers to that haven't, been able to kind of deal with the FCA's concerns adequately. There's been a pretty quick path to further follow-up work in terms of skilled person reviews, in terms of sometimes requirements limiting, aspects of the business, no new acquisitions, no new customers until the things are fixed. And I think that's what we're going to see here in and around ongoing advice, and probably as well around retirement income advice as well.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on swiftly to the consumer duty, because I think this is another key issue, because obviously it's a very big focus, as we all know, for the FCA. It's their flagship real consumer protection piece. And if you again reread that Dear CEO letter, Nick Humes, in October the 7th, it was very clear that it's going to be a focus for this year. I'm going to kick it off with a question. So Brian Foss. Hi, Brian. Good to see you. I haven't seen you for a long time. Hope you're well. Brian's asked a very interesting question, which I hadn't thought of, which is, FOS has just concluded a case which it will publish shortly, saying that the consumer duty is not relevant to the claim. Now, what basically Brian's asking here is effectively, is there an FCA definition of where the consumer duty does not apply, Brian's expectation, as is mine actually, is that it always applies.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't know anything about that particular case, so forgive me if I go around this. So, obviously, there is a kind of outer limit, a kind of scope to the duty. I mean, let's look at the dimensions of that. I mean, one is time, so it doesn't apply retrospectively. So if you had an issue with how something was sold prior to 31st of July 2023, the duty wouldn't be relevant there. It'd be more about the kind of regulatory requirements at the time. And I suppose even there, it's worth remembering that in some of those cases, there are similar requirements to the duty. So, if it was around like a product governance issue, as you've mentioned before, Chris, like PROD was in place. It's been in place since 2018 when MiFID and the Insurance Distribution Directive came in. So there's a question of time. There's then a question of kind of scope. So it applies to retail clients. Although if you're opting up retail clients to professional status, it also applies to that bit too. Before you're going to get them out of the scope of the duty, the FCA was keen that that wasn't a weak point. So if you're checking on the client's knowledge and experience and wider criteria to opt them up to professional, and then the duty not applying, they'll be interested in how that's done. And then I suppose it also depends upon whether you're a UK firm or not. These are all fairly self-explanatory. And then I suppose finally, whether you've got a direct relationship with a retail client, or you're a firm that is or has a kind of material influence on other firms' retail client outcomes. So those are the kind of key scope bits. I mean, without knowing any more about that particular case, I'm not quite sure how to answer the rest of it. But obviously the ombudsman has to be is bound by following the FCA's rules and its wider guidance. I think as we get more cases that come out after the duty was enforced, let's make an assumption on that, we'll start to get a sense of that. But I suppose if it's around a detailed rule that was already in place, which is probably an extension of what you'd expect under the duty, you don't need the duties underpinning to work out that on that specific aspect of suitability, that was the standard because there's detailed rules there, then perhaps you could get that situation. But let's not spend too much longer speculating. I suppose the key point is I'd expect most things going forward to involve the duty in some way. But as a kind of classic consultant, maybe former regulator, it'll probably depend. It'll depend upon the nature of the client, the nature of the issue, and whether it's more about product governance or about some kind of detailed conduct of business issue where you've got other rules that probably take precedence.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to focus on, I think a key area is the second outcome, fair value. And I know you've done
Yeah,
some yourself, Michael, and the Bovill Newgate team on this. Um, what do you think? I mean, what I've heard, in across the marketplace over the last 12 months or so is that the FCA may want or encourage or like to see almost like a price comparator website, which looks at financial advisors, prices and charges and so forth, but so that they can better or to prove that financial advisors themselves are benchmarking their costs and their
yeah,
charges in the right way to offer to meet that fair value criteria. What would you say are the principal areas that the FCA are very interested in this year
sure.
on price and value?
Yeah, so I was at the FCA till a couple of years ago, so I'll give that perspective. And obviously, been following closely since. I mean, I don't think the FCA wants to mandate how firms charge, and I don't think certainly it's in its plans to mandate some kind of disclosure format whereby then price comparison happens. I mean, what it wants is for firms to think very carefully about their charging model and how it applies to the customers, different groups of customers within it, whether it's kind of level of wealth, the nature of the service. Is it once and done? Is it modular? Is it a series of transactions? And how the charges apply, and then also whether people are getting the benefits from the service. Because remember, it's pretty easy to go straight to price. I think it's a race to the bottom when that outcome, it's price and value, and value is what you're paying relative to what you're getting. So I'd say no. There's lots of flexibility for talking about advisors in how you charge. Hourly rate, fixed fee. percentage-based charges based on assets under advice, mixture of the above, some disclosure requirements, how you put them out there. But the FCA is not going to suddenly say, I don't think, no longer charges based on assets under advice. So I don't think that's going to happen. What it does want, though, and it's in the rules, is that when firms do their value assessments, there's a few key bits. I mean, number one, know your charges, not just your stated charges, but then the reality of what people actually incur, and know that and how it applies to different groups. Now, because of some other more prescriptive rules about cost and charges disclosure, firms need to provide this to clients anyway. They need to do it upfront, and then they need to do it in arrears. So hopefully they've got that data, and you're looking to see whether what we thought was going to happen is reflected in reality. So I think that's a good thing. And sometimes in the work that we do with clients, some firms have got that. They've got a lovely graph showing the distribution of charges across the profile of clients, and that's been illuminating for some firms. They've found some clients for whom they're quite frankly undercharging. It may have been discounts gone awry in the past, some weird and wonderful family agreement, and so on. But these firms are just uneconomic serving that given service. And then the firms have thought, well, actually, are they the people that we want to keep? And if we do want to keep them, is it in that service or is it something different? So I think there are benefits here for firms. The opposite of that is at the other end of that distribution, they've sometimes found some customers for whom their charging model is having a really unforeseen impact. And I'll take this as an extreme example because it's in one of the published supervisory notices of the FCA, but there was a firm recently, I won't mention the firm name, but they had a charging model, they're a wealth manager, and they had some fixed charges that applied regardless of the portfolio size. And for some clients, they were equating to annualized charges of over 100% per annum. I think 164% for some. And that's an extreme example, but I think it highlights my point. You want to look at the distribution of charges. The next thing is, because remember, we're not about price only, we're about value, is the benefit. So what is it you're doing for that? And do all of the, if your service has got, 3 key elements or 6 or whatever it is, are they accessible to all clients? Because the point is, if you're doing something but there's no real benefit or utility to the end client, then is it really a benefit? Or is it more of a feature and that distinction? So look at that. And then finally, look at whether those benefits are being accessed and used. And this comes back and links back to ongoing service. So we know if we look at the total cost of solution for clients who are invested via an advisor in the UK, majority of the time, the largest charge is the ongoing advisor charge. So the key point there is let's look at whether that service has been delivered. If we're committing to do 4 client updates, or we think the client portal is really important, it's a key feature. Are people accessing it? Are they using it? But I think this is where your point to having the kind of data needed to kind of demonstrate that is key. And I think it has been a bit of a challenge for some firms to kind of evolve the data from what they had before, focused around risks and issues and breaches, to more, well, actually, can we see data more around client outcomes? But it can be done. It definitely can be done. And obviously, once you've got the charges, you've got the benefits, you compare the two. Now, as part of that, one of the things the FCA says that you need to consider is like one or more of a number of factors, and a key one of those is benchmarking. So find some firms that are akin to you, look at what they're charging, hopefully for the same thing that you're doing, and work out how your charges look for that. There are other options too. You could look at the cost to serve if you want to. We find firms tend to do this a bit less. It's a bit more complex. So, if they work out what the equivalent of your hourly rate is, Chris, if you're an advisor, and then your power planners and all the other costs, as they actually, our average cost to serve for a new client, initial advice on XYZ is X. We apply our profit margin, that which is Y, and our charges is Z. And you look at that and take a view on that. The FCA will not be willing or able to micro supervise fair value, but it will look at whether firms themselves are asking themselves the right questions, coming to those conclusions, not just in aggregate, like for all my clients it's the same, but where necessary, for different groups within there. And I imagine, as we've seen already in the wealth sector, going after the firms that scan as either outliers, they're just different and strange, or high risk in the case of that firm that I mentioned before.
Yeah, and yeah, thanks for that. I mean, we're seeing lots of great work actually across all these
Yeah,
areas.
some really good stuff.
We're seeing, a lot of our firms who are on model office, a lot of our clients, they can evidence because we use benchmarking and they can evidence,
Yeah,
where their service proposition is and is it offering that fair value piece against similar peer firms. So
yeah.
that's really good. And the outputs that are really interesting. And I think the key issue comes back to what I was saying earlier on in the presentation is it can you join the dots, from your service proposition, an investment proposition, retirement proposition, whatever it is, to make sure that that fair value piece is because that's a subjective issue, right? So at the end of the day, are you engaging your clients? Are you surveying your clients as well as looking internally within the
Yeah.
business and so forth? So I think that's taking a holistic review across that is really important. With time in mind, can we just focus on?
What can I say? What
Go
additional
on.
point? I'll be really quick on that. So the other thing, obviously, as an advisor or any kind of intermediary, yes, looking at your own charges is really important. But to the extent then you're picking other product services from the market to recommend or provide to your clients, that's the other element of fair value that we didn't touch on. Like you're looking at those firms, looking at their fair value assessments, you're kicking the tires on them. My sense is some of those are variable quality, and then you're doing that because that's your job. You're scanning the market relevant to your service and its breadth and depth, and you're making that choice. So fair value, yeah, it is about you and your service and your charging model, but it's also thinking about the other elements within there. And as well, then if you're the end intermediary facing off to the client, looking at the aggregate charges, the kind of total cost of solution for you and the products and the platforms and investments and other services that you recommend, and doing it that lens as well. And I'll
Thank you.
finish up the point there.
No, thank you. And just touching on vulnerability very quickly. Where do you think firms are on the vulnerability piece? Because we know that the FCA produced a questionnaire, quite an in-depth questionnaire last year,
Mm,
back end of last year, about vulnerability because they're obviously concerned about it. And I think that's going to
mm.
kick on into this suitability 2.0 area we're talking about. What do and obviously the client segmentation piece. What are your views on that, Michael?
Sure. I mean, it is a key focus. I think there's work ongoing and the outputs are due shortly from the FCA. And I think that will be a key kind of publication in terms of taking that really good guidance that's already out there and then just kind of looking at what needs to be modified within that relative to the duty now being in place. Because obviously, vulnerabilities writ large, get my teeth in, across the detailed requirements within the duty, whether it's product design, whether it's price and value, support, the needs of vulnerable customers are key within there. In terms of where firms are, I think it's varied across different sectors. So I think you're always at risk of making too broader assumptions. If we go for the kind of wealth sector as a proxy, because obviously the FCA has been looking at this and talking about it quite a lot externally, it's clear they don't think firms are doing enough. The initial focus has been around identification, just because I think within their data-led work, so few firms had significant proportions of vulnerable customers. My sense is, speak to people and maybe the FCA in the margins, those numbers are increasing. So I think firms are getting better at identification, which is the key first step. You can't act to kind of deal with vulnerability unless you know it's there. And it's really challenging. There's some really good firms out there that can help you get there if you need that support. But the key point is it's not just about identifying. You're identifying because then you're going to do something. You're going to consider it, and if need be, do something differently. Now, I think with many firms, if you take advice as a good example, the nature of the service is already very individualized. Lots of firms out there already have, modifications to how they deal with clients, whether it's kind of different formats, different meetings, different types of content in their key documents dependent upon financial capability, or they're getting in, they're asking maybe more vulnerable elderly clients to have a friend or family member with them to help them navigate this. So there's already a lot of good work out there. I think in this vulnerability publication, we'll get a bit more of a point, and I imagine a call to action for maybe some or all firms to do a bit more about that next stage. What do you do about it, and are you doing enough? But like with all these things, a bit like the move to better MI, this is going to be a bit of a journey because it is complex. And so I think as long as the FCA can see that the direction of travel is positive, then I imagine it'll be supportive of firms getting there in a reasonable time. But I think if they have not done anything, or where they identify issues, they don't take action, those are the kind of firms where I think you're more likely to have some kind of intervention, particularly where the nature of that vulnerability has a real impact on the quality and the potential harm from the outcomes being delivered.
Thanks for that. And we've got one question in about polluter pays. Let's touch on that. And we've only got
Yeah,
six,
sure.
5 minutes left. So we've got a couple of
I know.
areas
It's
to touch on.
fine.
Polluter pays, advice gap, and we'll do a little bit of data at the end if we've got time. So polluter pays, what's your views?
Yeah, I mean, that's another of the publications that was due out that hasn't come out. I saw that the FCA had done an update on its website in the meantime, clarifying its expectations around how firms deal with liabilities. So that's out there. I think it was published on the 15th of Jan. Obviously, the point here is that the prudential framework for advisors, at least, how it treats redress is maybe not as sophisticated as it is for some of the other prudential regimes. So the one for kind of MiFID investment firms, it's much more dynamic there in terms of risk and redress and how it's dealt with. So the FCA is looking to try and deal with that. I mean, it's hard because the nature of the prudential framework for financial advisors is such that it doesn't take too many successful claims to kind of erode firms' base capital. So this is looking to kind of try and provide an additional buffer zone. The challenge for the SAA will be how do they supervise it? Because it's basically on firms to say, oh, okay, I've got some complaints, or I've identified an issue in my consumer duty MI. There could be a redress liability. I need to calculate. I need to hold capital, and I think the FCA's best method of policing that, if firms aren't willing to tell them, is via the ombudsman and the complaints they get from there. So it's going to be challenging, but I think it's looking to fix a problem. Whether it will, I don't know. Although I do think now, within the context of this wider debate on growth, it might be the kind of issue that is like revisited, in terms of the impact versus the costs on business.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the advice gap. So one of the best things I think about the advice gap harks back to the 2013 launch of the FCA that you may remember,
Yep,
which is all behavioral
do.
economics, right? So, and the key area of the behavioral economics piece was knowing the client, knowing the
Yep.
biases, knowing what makes them tick, and supporting them. So from that side of it, I think that targeted support piece is really interesting. How do you see the advice gap playing out this year? Do you think it's going to actually get somewhere? Is it going to get some more meat on the
Yeah,
bone?
this is an identified issue. This issue of people not getting enough support and suffering bad outcomes because of it. Number one, and then number two, it's also kind of an area where, with regulatory intervention, it can stimulate growth. It can get money to work. It can get better outcomes. So it's ticking all of the boxes. I think if you look at the content of the current CP, the kind of sketches, not the detailed rules, the FCA is being, relatively, well, no, not even relatively, quite innovative. It's quite a kind of risk-taking regime built upon the consumer duty. So I think there's definitely an appetite there. I don't think financial advisors have a lot to fear here, in the sense that their clients are perhaps not the core candidates for those that are likely to want and need target support. And indeed, I think target support might help incubate future advisory clients down the line. So I think there's lots of opportunity here, and it's a good example of government and regulator coming together to tackle a known issue. And let's be honest, with the nature of where things are in the UK, people will need ever more support around these key elements of their finances. So it's absolutely crucial that we've got a
Yep.
sector that can have different channels to do that.
And I think we just put up a poll. Hopefully, you can see it on your screen. So, do you see the advice gap as an opportunity? The majority just about are saying yes. So, that's an interesting one, which is good. And the final area that I'd like to really cover with you very briefly is looking at the data piece, because at the end of the day, we've got a data-led regulator. What does that mean for firms? What data do they need? We think we've got a good spread on it and a good handle on it by
Yeah.
that slide I put up earlier on. What's your views on that one?
Yeah, so the FCA's had a period whereby it's not actively supervised the large population of financial advisors. Back in the day, firms were on a regulatory cycle. They'd be visited every 3 or 4 years, depending on how big they were. That stopped and it moved to kind of more reactive supervision. And that's created a number of risks and issues. There are blind spots for the FCA. Some firms said they enjoyed that contact. It was helpful in the past. This will be a big change this year. We've seen it already in the wealth sector. It's going to be mimicked in the advice sector. So expect data requests that really get to the heart of key aspects of firms' business models, resources, business model, charging approach, compliance resources, and other key features in terms of like outsourcing, risk, complaints, and whatnot. Some firms might feel this is quite intrusive. Hopefully, those that are already well set up with the right data, perhaps those using Model Office, will be in a good position to respond to it. I think if you can't, then it might suggest some gaps in your approach. But it's really important. I think firms, do a good job on this, because if you misanswer the questions, we've seen cases where then the FCA is coming in, they think one thing, the reality is something different. And so it's really important to take the time to respond to that. And we give a lot of support to clients in this space to try and make sure they put their best foot forward, and so that they're not called out unnecessarily. But I think key outcome is a number of firms this year will be supervised within the wider population who probably weren't and haven't been in the recent past.
I think you're right. And I think, we just put a poll on that. If you received an FCA data request, how confident are you in that you can access all the relevant data in a meaningful format? Confident, there's 31%, maybe 62%, and no chance, only 8%. So I think I'd take that as a good, right at the end of today's session. Look, Michael, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
You've been very generous with it. Hopefully, our participants have enjoyed your views on the market. We will put this online. It will be all over social media on the recording, and we'll send out the PowerPoint slides as well. So big thanks to Michael. Hopefully you'll be ready for next year's session that we'll do.
Of course, if you're willing to have me back.
Let's make it a hat trick. So thanks so much, and thanks so much to our participants. Thanks so much for your time today, and have a great weekend when it comes. All the best.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Cheers.